Across humanity, stories witness us, and through them we see, we hear, and we grow. I'm Pauline Chu.
And I'm Peter Rizzi, and this is Book Feels, a podcast about how books made us feel and how we feel about books. On today's episode of Book Feels, we're going to be talking about the Joy Luck Club. The Joy Luck Club was written in 1989 by Amy Tan, a Chinese-American writer from the Bay Area. It's her first full-length novel, and it's set in San Francisco and the surrounding area. The book is structured like a mahjong table being one of the key symbols throughout the book, where the 4 parts of the book are each split into 4 sections to make 16 total chapters, and each of these chapters is a vignette covering a single character. These characters are 4 pairs of Chinese-American mothers and daughters. So we have Su Yan and June, or her Chinese name, Jingmei Wu. We have An Mei Su and her daughter, Rose Su Jordan, Lindo and Waverly Zhang, Ying Ying and Lena St. Clair. This book is very full. There's so many stories we could dive into, and we won't get to it all, although we probably could. Pauline, this book was one from your list. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit more about your relationship with this book?
Yeah, for sure. I think that this book is incredibly important to me. I am Vietnamese American, and I had never read any book like this. I read this really young, but even to this day, even though there's a lot of Asian American literature available now, there's not a lot like this book. This is a seminal piece of Asian American work and also American canon. It's taught in high schools, and it's discussed in the general grand literature canon, which I think is really amazing, particularly from an immigrant perspective. Obviously, there are certain criticisms. It was written in the 80s/90s. So there are definitely criticisms of how it didn't age well. And also at the time, there were criticisms from other Asian American authors. We won't cover them here. That's not what this podcast is for. As usual, this podcast is about how books made us feel. It's more of an emotional analysis rather than a literary analysis. And this book certainly made us feel a lot. So let's talk about how the story begins. It begins with a story about a swan, a very beautiful, almost like a legend, and that I think really captures almost the entire book, the essence of the book. Oh, Peter, will you read us a passage?
I will. Then the woman and the swan sailed across an ocean many thousands of li wide, stretching their necks towards America. On her journey, she cooed to the swan, "In America, I will have a daughter just like me. But over there, nobody will say her worth is measured by the loudness of her husband's belch. Over there, nobody will look down on her because I will make her speak only perfect American English. And over there, she will always be too full to swallow any sorrow. She will know my meaning because I will give her this swan, a creature that became more than what was hoped for." Now the woman was old, and she had a daughter who grew up speaking only English and swallowing more Coca-Cola than sorrow. For a long time now, the woman had wanted to give her daughter the single swan feather and tell her, "This feather may look worthless, but it comes from afar and carries with it all my good intentions." And she waited, year after year, for the day she could tell her daughter this in perfect American English.
So we truncated the passage a little bit just for the sake of time, but even abridged, it's such a beautiful piece of writing.
It really is, and I think it's a great lead-in to one of the major topics we're going to talk about so much in this book: women swallowing their sorrow, repressing their feelings, and being perfect, essentially. And that's exactly what the mother is wishing for her daughter here, that she will always be too full to swallow any sorrow, that she won't have to have that same painful experience that she did. And yet, as we kind of find out in this book, most of the daughters do end up having that experience.
Yes, you cannot escape the intergenerational trauma. Along with this idea of women swallowing their sorrow and kind of burying it, a very poignant part of the passage is that the mother waits to tell her daughter all of her story and what the feather means to her. until she can speak perfect English, particularly American English. And I think that that's something throughout the book, this lack of communication between the mothers and the daughters. And by the end of the book, it kind of feels like to me they still don't really talk. They still don't really connect because of the language barrier. And I think because of the emotional barriers there, that there's too much pain that's walled off behind a dam. And I think that for the mothers, it's a little too hard for them to break through that dam. This really is reflected in, I will probably switch between calling her June and Jingmei. Her English name is June. The book opens and we learn that her mother has died very suddenly from some sort of stroke or aneurysm, and she has taken her mother's place in a mahjong game with her mother's friends, who are also the other mothers in the story. And it comes out that her mother had found or contacted her long lost daughters, so June's long lost half sisters. They're somewhere in China, and they don't know that her mother has died. The aunts beseech June to go to China and tell her sisters about her mom. And June says, I didn't even know my mom, or something to that effect.
She does, and it's such a interesting place for June to reveal that she feels she doesn't even know her mom, to be able to tell her half sisters about her, because she's sitting at her mom's spot at the mahjong table, which the mahjong table began as the Joy Luck Club, which is the title of this book. The Joy Luck Club is something that Su Yan, June's mother, started when she was living in China during the Japanese invasion as a way to keep spirits up during the war. She started it with a few other wives of soldiers, wives of generals. And here June is in this reincarnation in America of the Joy Luck Club, where she's finding herself telling her mother's friends that I wouldn't even know where to start with describing my mom to someone else. And yet there's all this history just right there at the table itself.
Yeah, and I think that the even the phrasing Joy Luck Club, it carries all of this woman's hopes and dreams for a better future and for something that cannot be captured in American English or in English in general. And likewise, the swan story, the swan represents all these beautiful hopes and dreams that she had. And in the story, the swan is taken away and she only has a feather to give her daughter. And that is a precious gift, just like Joy Luck. And it's something that the American daughters just can't understand because of a language barrier, because of a cultural barrier. And so they don't know their mothers completely, and in a way they can't know them completely because of these barriers. And I'm going to read a passage during which June is talking to these mothers, and they're desperately telling her, tell your sisters about your mother's kindness, about her intellect, about everything. They're listing all these things kind of frantically. And June thinks, they are frightened. In me, they see their own daughters, just as ignorant, just as unmindful of all the truths and hopes they have brought into America. They see daughters who grow impatient when their mothers talk in Chinese, who think they are stupid when they explain things in fractured English. They see that joy and luck do not mean the same to their daughters, that to these closed, American-born minds, joy luck is not a word. It does not exist. They see daughters who will bear grandchildren born without any connecting hope, passed from generation to generation.
Yeah, this passage really sets the scene for what is going to happen in this book, which is a piece by piece exploration of 4 different mother-daughter pairs, where each mother is coping with this new realization that their daughters really don't know them after Su Yan has passed, and they now see that June is unable to describe her mother. These mothers begin to reflect on their past, how little their daughters understand about it. And then we hear from the daughters about the differences they perceive in their relationships with their mothers. So it's really a good way to kind of set the scene for the rest of the book.
Yeah, and what I love about the book is how much perspective it gives us of the interior lives of both generations. Because I think that, particularly as, I am an Asian American woman, I'm Vietnamese American, And I obviously can only experience my own interior life. And I know logically that my mother has her own, but I related so much to the daughters in this book because, of course, they're American born, and they see just kind of the surface of their mothers, this kind of cheesy and also broken English, like that way of speaking. And the mothers never really reveal their interior. So I think that we're going to talk first about June and how her perspective really differs from her mother's, particularly her perspective of herself. Her mother really wants her to be a prodigy of some kind. She tries to make her into some sort of movie star. She has her watch Shirley Temple movies, things like that. She tries to make her into a piano prodigy. She puts her in music lessons, and ultimately that ends in humiliation because June cannot really play the piano. um, and it kind of accumulates into a really huge fight.
And I think what's interesting is that there's a bit of nuance here where, yes, June isn't a piano prodigy, but she also doesn't try to play the piano well because she sort of sees herself as this manifestation of what her mom wants. She realizes that. And I think you're going to read a passage that really reveals that.
In fact, in the beginning, I was just as excited as my mother, maybe even more so. I picture this prodigy part of me as many different images, trying each one on for size. I was a dainty ballerina girl standing by the curtains, waiting to hear the right music that would send me floating on my tiptoes. I was like the Christ child lifted out of the straw manger, crying with holy indignity. I was Cinderella stepping from her pumpkin carriage with sparkly cartoon music filling the air. In all of my imaginings, I was filled with a sense that I would soon become perfect. My mother and father would adore me. I would be beyond reproach. I would never feel the need to sulk for anything. But sometimes the prodigy in me became impatient. If you don't hurry up and get me out of here, I'm disappearing for good, it warned, and then you'll always be nothing. I wanted to read that passage because it speaks to this misunderstanding from the child and also this interpretation from the child that they are nothing unless they are exactly what their parents want them to be. In this case, her mom wants her to be exceptional and amazing and a prodigy of some kind. And at some point in the book, June says that she can only be her. And she actually as you mentioned, she slacks off on purpose. She doesn't do her schoolwork on purpose because she's rebelling against her mother's wishes. I want to note that that's still something that is a decision that's still tied to her mother. All of her failures, all of her half-finished degrees, they're still tied to her mom. They're never really an act of rebellion because of her parents. Suyan, as you mentioned, tells June these kind of horrific stories about leaving her children at the side of the road, about her family home being burned down and knowing that the whole family was gone. And she says it kind of without emotion. She says it kind of vaguely. And I think that there are facts recounted, but there's no emotion shared. There's not really true vulnerability there of revealing herself as a whole human. And I think that that's something that I have definitely experienced a lot of in my family. I think that families who experience war just don't talk about war, and except on very rare occasions where something kind of comes out robotically and there's not true connection there. And I think that June feels almost like not a full person sometimes. And I think that's why, yes, she can't finish things. And also, she can't maintain healthy friendships because her and Waverly are super dysfunctional. um, but also, I think that she herself thinks that she doesn't deserve the best or anything good.
I couldn't relate more that when war affects families, it really isn't talked about. And you and I have reflected on how your family being refugees from Vietnam, my grandfather being a U.S. veteran who fought in Vietnam and was very traumatized by his experience there. What we were told by my mom, it's my mom's father, was, oh, you don't ask him about that, because me and my cousin being curious, 9 and 10-year-old boys, when we found out Grandpa was in the war, we wanted to ask him about it. And it was always, you can't talk to him about that. You can't ask him about that. And now as my grandparents get older, as he gets older, I just wonder what is left, what he's holding on to there that, like you said, for me to be able to live and express myself to the fullest, being able to name and carry my whole family story with me, but there's so much information that hasn't been shared.
Yeah. And that I think lives in our bones anyway. For me, quite literally, I think that the Vietnam War unfortunately had a lot of chemical warfare, and that is still in the bloodstreams of many Vietnamese people across the world. And I'm pretty sure it's in my family's. And I think that it's affected our bodies completely. It's altered us. And yet it's this like big thing that no one can talk about. No one in my family talks about the war. And I think it's in this book as well that no one really talks about the war. They think about it. They tell their story to us, the reader, but they don't tell it to each other, which is just such a shame.
And we keep going to war, this world. And I wonder how much of it is because we don't talk about
Yeah.
what happened in the past. It's really tragic.
Yeah. So I think what we can talk about, I'd love to talk about this, how the effects of war and how they kind of echo throughout the generations. And we really see this in Ying Ying and Lena, the next mother-daughter pairing we'll talk about. Ying Ying is introduced as kind of this very fragile woman who's afraid of everything. It's not explicitly stated in the book, but she has PTSD. She has PTSD from the horrors that she suffered, and not necessarily from war. Certainly that might have played a role. Just the general environment in China was not safe, and there were not options for women. But I think that this is primarily due to a really horrible marriage that Ying Ying was in China, and a baby that she aborted. And what struck me was how much Ying Ying's fears and PTSD were literally passed down to Lena. And Lena starts seeing death and destruction kind of everywhere she goes. And that's a direct result of Ying Ying's mental instability.
Yeah, there's this example. I think Lena is maybe 6 years old, and there's this basement door in their family house that is like double padlocked. Like you said, Ying Ying is someone who sees a lot of scary things happening out in the world and is a superstitious person. And, double padlocks this basement door for some reason that Lena is curious about. Lena has been told not to go near the basement. But eventually, she's 6 or 7, she figures out how to get through both of these padlocks. She opens the basement door and she basically falls 6 feet to the cement floor. It's an unfinished basement, and her mom comes running and says something like, "You can't go down there. There's a scary man down there who will impregnate you." To a 6-year-old girl. So this whole imagination surrounding there being threats everywhere. And after that moment, Lena begins to see threats everywhere in her environment. She sees kids who are swinging, and then the swing falls. The swing falls
I'd
off.
actually. Do you want to read a passage
Sure.
for that?
And after that, I began to see terrible things. I saw these things with my Chinese eyes, the part of me I got from my mother. I saw devils dancing feverishly beneath a hole I dug in the sandbox. I saw that lightning had eyes and searched to strike down little children. I saw a beetle wearing the face of a child, which I promptly squashed with the wheel of my tricycle. And when I became older, I could see things that Caucasian girls at school did not. Monkey rings that would split in two and send a swinging child hurtling through space. Tether balls that could splash a girl's head all over the playground in front of laughing friends.
Ooh, what a passage.
And the next line that I just saw as I passed you that book was, I didn't tell anyone about the things I saw. Oh, what a poor, alone little girl.
Yeah, she doesn't even really tell her father about it. It's really buried inside her as this kind of Chinese secret. It's her Chinese side, it's her Chinese eyes, and it comes from her mother. This, what we would call today hypervigilance, I suppose, or PTSD episodes. And nobody's helping her. Obviously, nobody really helps her mother, as you and I discussed off mic. Lena's father's kind of bumbling.
You might even call them hallucinations.
Yeah, which I think are another symptom
PTSD
of
response, yeah.
PTSD. Yeah. Um, and it's something that I recall also kind of being a really worried child. I was kind of anxious about everything. And I remember my best friend from childhood called me dramatic. Um, and I think, she was a child, but I think now as we're older, yeah, I understand that that wasn't drama, or I wasn't being dramatic in being anxious or worried about everything. That was all inherited fear because of how much my family suffered and also how much they really literally transfer their suffering onto me. My mother was such a catastrophe thinker. She was scared of everything. Uh, Even just like one paper cut, she would freak out. And then she would also, when something was very big and something was actually really serious, she would shut down completely and not really react. So I think that really warped my sense of reality. And I didn't know what to be afraid of. So I think I was afraid of everything. And it really feels very similar to Lena.
That's really my experience as a child too, being a really worried kid and not telling anyone.
Hmm.
Like you said, you had a friend who called you dramatic. I had so many experiences that lived completely in my head, and I had sorts of developed ways of coping with worry. I had like sort of repetitive tics I would do as a kid. I remember for a while, one of them was I grew up Catholic, and I would make the sign of the cross when I was scared or worried.
Aw.
And I can just remember like being in the backseat of a car that was going too fast and like curling my head down and making my little sign of the cross to myself, or yeah, just manifesting worry out in the world and being really alone with it.
Yeah, do you think that has anything to do with your gender as well? I guess you mentioned you're an only child, so.
Only child, being a boy. Yeah, it's, it's amazing to think that even at 5 or 6 years old, boys already know what you do and don't talk about with other boys.
Oh,
In
that's
terms
so
of,
sad.
yeah, that's not really something I would share. But I think, yes, I think that is internalized by then for me. Yeah,
Oh. Yeah, I think that obviously we are different genders and we have different gender experiences, but I think that this idea of secrecy is really key here. Secrecy was a big theme in my family. Silence is a big theme in my family. I think that's also maybe how they learn to protect themselves, both in war and who knows what else, to be honest. And also, maybe also during their own experience as immigrants in a country that didn't really like them. There was a lot of racism that they experienced when they first moved to the US. And I think that silence and secrecy were really their only weapons or modes of defense. And I certainly felt that as a child. My I told you my best friend she hurt me when she called me dramatic. So I sort of learned to not really say anything for a long time. And I still struggle with that habit. I still struggle. Like, this podcast is a great exercise in challenging myself to be forthright and honest and vulnerable in a way that has been difficult for me my whole life. And I think also we talked about this off mic as well, that Lena is the person we probably relate to the most.
definitely.
So, yeah.
I think something else we wanted to talk about. Lena ends up choosing a bad marriage for herself. Um, a marriage where she and her husband split costs to such an extreme that they have a list of items on the fridge,
Yeah, it feels
dollars and cents for toothpaste.
yeah, it feels incredibly petty, honestly.
Really petty. And Lena's struggling with this in this marriage, and Ying Ying sees it. And I think it really brings in a theme that is pervasive throughout the whole book, that we can really look back at Ying Ying's childhood and see how it developed, is the cultural position of women in China. Um, there were not options for any of these mothers
Mhm.
as young as when they were some of them 2 years old, and getting wed to other men. Just no options. Some of the quotes that stand out from when Ying Ying was growing up: "A girl can never ask, only listen. A girl should stand still. Woman is yin and man is yang." And someone tells Ying Ying that essentially when Ying Ying wants to go play or do something expressive, and they're basically telling her, you can't do that, but boys can do that. And it's just the way it is.
Yeah. It's actually her first chapter, Ying Ying's first chapter, starts off with the sentence, For all these years, I kept my mouth closed so selfish desires would not fall out. And she does eventually, talking about Lena's marriage, she does eventually wish that her daughter had a voice and didn't behave the same way she behaved. She says that she claims that she raised her daughter to be different, but her daughter still turned out to be the same. And, this idea of yin and yang and how women are the darkness within where untempered passions lie, and man is yang, bright truth, lighting our minds. Well, first of all, puke.
Double puke.
But also just the how these women, as you mentioned, didn't really stand a chance against that type of societal and cultural rhetoric, and how they passed down their own feeling of inferiority to their daughters. As a result, Lena cannot really stand up to her husband. They start off splitting the check because they're not really dating, and they keep doing it even though they're dating, and then they keep doing it even though they're married. And she never really wanted to do it in the first place.
And in the book, this belief remains.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, it is passed down to the daughters, this inferiority. And it's really tragic.
Yeah, and I think you see it even in our society today. Like, obviously I'm coming at it from a Vietnamese perspective. I have my own brand of patriarchal bullshit and misogyny that is instilled in me and that I am actively trying to rewire. But I think that you see it in most countries, certainly in the US where we live. And I think that, you and I have talked about how it really hurts everybody, these gender roles and expectations.
It really does. Pauline, I'll just acknowledge it feels like we're jumping all over the place. This book is a really hard one to cover because of the way it's split into these mother-daughter stories that come one after the other in no particular order.
8 storylines weaving together.
We are going to shift focus to a new mother-daughter pairing. So this is Lindo and Waverly. Waverly's story, she is this actual chess prodigy.
Right.
She is out there winning all these competitions from a very young age. She's on the cover of some magazine, I don't know which one, but a big one, as one of the youngest grandmasters, youngest women grandmasters. So she is, in kind of contrast to June, who we talked about earlier, is a genuine prodigy. And Lindo, her mother, loves it. Lindo is basking in it. Lindo loves nothing more than to take her daughter out to the grocery store, out to the market, out to church, and say, "This is my daughter Waverly. She just won her 4th trophy. I spend all my days dusting her trophies because she's won so many." And Lindo loves that. Waverly does not. Waverly is quite embarrassed, annoyed that her mom triumphs her chess victories as her own.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, Peter, you come from a Western background. I don't know how far back in terms of generations you go in America, but what is your perspective there? Like, is that something that your parents ever did to you? Because that's something that is so Asian to me, but
I think growing up, I was not a prodigy. I was not
we could debate that.
good at chess or something in particular. But I was very high achieving in school. I was an athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents enjoyed that. Very much enjoyed that. I think not so much in actively claiming this sort of ownership in the way that maybe Lindo is with Waverly,
right,
and this sort of bragging nature. I don't think it was ever so overt, but it was very clear that if I were not doing those things, something would be wrong. That I was supposed to achieve really well, do really well, and my parents enjoyed the compliments they got from other parents based on my success.
Right. Yeah, it also sounds like maybe there was a lot of value put on those things, and maybe that translated or was associated with your own value as a person.
It's interesting because I thought for the longest time that I did well in those things because I valued them.
Mm.
But an 8-year-old who's finishing top of the class in 2nd grade isn't choosing to do that because that's what they care about. Maybe in some contexts, but I think mostly it was passed down.
Yeah.
It was kind of this inherited inclination towards achievement.
Yeah, and I think that, I think it is really, for me, very Asian for a parent to be so overtly saying, you are the product of me, thus your achievements are my achievements. That feels so cultural. But I think that in a way, like most parents feel that way. Most parents see you as an extension of them. And so your happiness should be their happiness. Your success is their success. And I think some parents maybe lose sight of the actual just person inside all of those things. And I think that's a little bit of how Waverly feels about her mother in this scene that you're referencing of her mother embarrassing her and telling everybody and bragging about Waverly as if it was her achievements. And Waverly just kind of feeling like maybe that she doesn't matter. It's more her achievements matter and she doesn't.
It's interesting what you say that it feels like this exists in most families. I would agree. And that there's some uniqueness to the Asian cultural element here.
Right.
From my perspective, as a non Asian person, there are a lot of eyes on Asian achievement in Western society, this kind of model minority idea. What do you think about that?
Oh God. How much time do you have? I think that it's so the way I mentioned before that silence and suppression is used as shields and as weapons in, I don't want to say Asian culture as like a monolith. I will just speak to my own experience as a Vietnamese American woman. That was wielded in my family and in my experience. Um, as well as this kind of obedience in relation to the system that you're living in order to succeed. So, similarly, I think I was pretty high achieving as a child, and as uh, as in most of my academic career, I was pretty high achieving, and that was something that was expected of me, and it wasn't something that I was praised for because it was just expected. And I don't want to. That's not necessarily the worst thing I've ever suffered. I in a lot of ways I'm grateful for the achievements that I've been able to do, and I'm grateful for the impetus for those achievements because they've brought me a lot of success and comfort, I suppose, and stability. But I think that it is a lot of pressure and a lot of suppression of the self. Like, I think that you and I have talked about this in another life without that pressure, even if it was a tacit pressure, I would have been probably a creative person. I am a creative now, but I think I would have worked professionally in a creative medium. And I really regret that. That makes me extremely sad. I think I could have done something that is extremely fulfilling. And instead, my professional life is not necessarily fulfilling. And that's really hard for me to wrap my head around that it's happened at such a young age before I could even speak, before I could even really understand what was happening around me.
Yeah, so much bigger than just you. And that's what really strikes me about it too is the pressure. Uh, when I look back on things I could have done or things I would have done differently, I think the reason I was inclined towards academics and went that route was because in some sense I could control how many mistakes I made.
Right.
I could study so much and know everything so well that I could get straight A's. What I really enjoyed doing as a kid was playing basketball. If you had asked me at 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old what I wanted to do, I wanted to be a professional basketball player.
Aw.
Um, and I'm tall, but I'm 6 feet tall, so I'm not like 7 feet tall. I might not have worked out, but I definitely think that was an area where I couldn't control how many mistakes I made.
Right.
You have a lot less control over that in a team environment in a high pressure situation, and I folded under pressure because it was so intense. The idea that I could underperform, that I could make mistakes, and instead I went into an avenue where I could limit and control um, how much my exposure to being imperfect or making a mistake was. And that is such a loss that I still wrestle with today.
Yeah, and that's also kind of what happens to Waverly. I think she buckles under the pressure of being a chess prodigy, especially considering the pressure her mother puts on her. She has this tantrum and she kind of just basically runs away from home for a little while. And then when she gets back, her mother ices her out and ignores her. And after that, she can't really perform. She keeps losing competitions. She loses to people who she easily beat before. And she eventually puts her chess set away. And, as an adult, she's a lawyer, which feels like a very almost like a stereotypical path, like, lawyer, engineer, doctor. Like that's the immigrant life and that's the immigrant narrative. And when you see somebody like that, like I think someone could look at me and maybe see a very typical immigrant narrative. Not that I'm a lawyer or anything like that, but that I went to a certain school and got a certain GPA, and they don't realize the story behind that person and what they could have been had they been given more space and also more support.
And what you said, this icing out that her mom begins now that Waverly has kind of rejected her mom's involvement in her chess, has ran away, has really created this permanent rupture, this lasting rupture. It continues this pervasive silent treatment. Later in the book, we're in this place where Waverly is remarrying, and she really wants her mom's approval. And in every way possible, she keeps trying to hint to her mom that she's becoming serious with this person, that he's now living with her. And her mom continues to ignore the fact that she has a developing relationship with someone. Um, and the silent treatment that her mom continues to give her as an adult, to me, is so painful. There's this one quote, it's short, where Waverly just says, "Oh, her strength, her weakness, both pulling me apart."
Oh,
Where she just sees this dynamic, intense interplay of both the stuff coming up in her and the stuff coming up in her mom, and this battle to get her mom's attention, but then also not upset her mom. I just totally can relate with this experience, and find it really sad that in her adult life, it's the same story over and over again with her mom.
yeah, and I think that in that passage, she and her mom do kind of see each other. They they don't really communicate, which is continues to be a theme throughout this book. They still don't really talk. I think it's more that Waverly kind of comes to term with who her mother is. Her mother doesn't really say very much. And I don't want this to be a parent hating podcast, but I think that I do have certain criticisms of, or I take a critical eye at prior generations. I see their suffering, but I also see how much suffering they caused others, and I just want to highlight that Waverly uh, sees who she is ultimately. She says, "I saw what I had been fighting for. It was for me, a scared child who had run away a long time ago, to what I had imagined was a safer place. And hiding in this place behind my invisible barriers, I knew what lay on the other side. Her side attacks, her secret weapons, her uncanny ability to find my weakest spots. But in the brief instant that I had peered over the barriers, I could finally see what was really there. An old woman, a walk for her armor, a knitting needle for her sword, getting a little crabby as she waited patiently for her daughter to invite her in." So I think that Waverly does find some peace in her love for her mother. But as you mentioned, there's this back and forth there. She really, I think she suffers a lot to find that peace because she's just really reading into every single thing her mother says or doesn't say, particularly her silences. And honestly, her mother really could have saved her a lot of suffering if she had just talked to her.
I totally agree. And it's one thing for Waverly to, yes, be able to see through to her mom and see that underneath all of that, she really is a warrior. Um, at the same time, it doesn't change that Waverly still wants that warrior's love and
Yeah.
approval. And who's to say, what's going to come for them in the future? The last mother-daughter pair we're going to talk about is Aunt May and Rose. We are introduced to Aunt May earlier in the book. I think we're going to skip ahead to when we're introduced to Rose, however. And Rose is in a marriage with this man named Ted that started when she was in college, and has been going for quite a while, and it's coming to an end. And the dynamic in their marriage was a victim hero dance where Rose was the perpetual victim, Ted the perpetual hero. There's this quote that Rose keeps coming back to where whenever they have a disagreement or a conflict, she always ends up saying, "Ted, you decide." And he decides. He becomes the hero. And it just struck me that, finally things start to go in a different way for Ted. He gets this malpractice lawsuit at work. And, all codependent things come to an end. You can't keep doing the codependent dance forever. And this new awakening in Ted leads to their marriage dissolving.
Peter, do you relate to that a little bit?
I certainly do.
Not that you were married.
I have dated pretty consistently since I was a teenager, and yeah, it's so easy in romantic relationships to get caught into certain roles.
It also, I think, feels romantic. I think Rose talks about how there's something romantic about, like,
Being
how,
rescued.
yeah, being rescued, falling into the bed, and him, like, taking charge. And yeah, it's just,
And
it's,
I think for me, being on the other side of that, um, seeing the romance in caretaking, in rescuing as
mm,
well, seeing
which is kind of what
being
Ted
seen by
likes.
that.
Yeah,
Yes, he
it makes him
does.
feel, I think, manly and competent and powerful. So I think that when he gets hit with that malpractice lawsuit, that shakes his confidence, and he realizes that it actually doesn't feel good to be the one who's in charge all the time.
Yeah, he starts saying, "I'm not gonna keep deciding everything, Rose. You need to finally stand up for yourself. We can't keep doing this." And Rose doesn't know what to do with herself.
Right. Yeah, and I think that this really comes from so many themes that we've talked about throughout each of the mother-daughter pairings. The intergenerational trauma of being a woman, being an Asian woman, and living in a Confucian society that's patriarchal, that values women the least. And it really, I think that An Mei, Rose's mother, sees this in her own mother, and then sees it in Rose herself. So she puts that, she kind of summarizes that in this beautiful quote of comparing them to stairs. She says, "All of us are like stairs, one step after another, going up and down, but all going the same way," which I think is a very poignant quote about how it doesn't feel like, to her, it doesn't really feel like there's a choice of how they can be, because of the hurt that they've passed down to each other.
No, she sees her daughter as an inevitable version of herself,
Right.
that her daughter is always going to be limited because she is limited.
Hmm.
Um, and these American daughters don't see things that way. These American daughters see things the American way, which says you can be whoever you want, whatever you want, and yet they're held back by this inherited, uh, like you said, all being like stairs, one step after the other, going up
Hmm.
and down, but all going the same way in the end.
Yeah, and I so relate to that as somebody who just has warring cultures inside of me. I grew up kind of being a feminist. I have always claimed that. I mean, I didn't claim it when I was like in middle school, but I claimed it later. And I was also always really frustrated at my mom for how much deference she gave to men, and how much she valued men's opinions, and how much she couldn't make a decision on her own. She needed a man to make that decision. And that was the way she was raised. And I found it kind of almost disgusting. I hated it. And at the same time, similar to you, I've been in a lot of codependent relationships where I was the one who wanted to be rescued all the time. I was the victim. And I wanted that. I felt safe, and I thought it was romantic, and I thought it was like stable. I thought it meant that that person was my soulmate.
Mm.
And I didn't realize it was just a manifestation of this rhetoric that lives inside my body and that I digested my whole life. And that was that my mother digested, and her mother, and the mother before that. It just really is. We can't deny the generational aspect of this.
There's this other quote when Rose starts seeing a psychiatrist for help with her marriage ending. On May, her mom's response is to say, "A mother knows best. A mother knows what is inside you. A psychiatrist will only," and says will only end up kind of creating chaos
Yeah, and
and
confusing.
confusion.
Hmm.
Uh, so interesting. Yeah, just the way the mother and daughters see their connection differently.
Yeah, and I think thankfully, it feels like Rose and Anmei kind of have the most growth in terms of their relationship out of the whole out of all four pairings of mothers and daughters, because at some point in the book, Anmei is telling Rose that she needs to fix her marriage, and Rose says, "I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know if I can do that." And Anmei says like that it's not about wanting to do it, it's just that she has to do it. It's her duty, which is very, I think, like, my mother is also extremely duty driven. She's not exactly love driven. She's driven by obligation, which is not something as an American I necessarily understand or relate to. And I actually actively resent it. And towards the end of the book, there's a little meeting in the middle where her mother pushes Rose and says, I wish you would stand up for yourself. And Rose says to her, like, please don't tell me to fix my marriage again. And her mother says, no, I'm not doing that. I am asking you to say what you want, to raise your voice a little bit.
It's interesting what you say about your mom being duty driven. And I know enough about your story to know that for a while, your mother did not want to get a divorce with your dad.
Right.
And thinking back to my parents, my dad being in a mixed immigrant family, one of the traditions that he really absorbed was this Catholic duty. The times that I've talked with him when he and my mom have been in conflict, it was always, well, because of my religion, I won't get a divorce. Catholicism really prioritizing marriage and the impossibility of divorce. So it is such a different way to view things from the way we view
Yeah.
them. We neither of us view duty and obligation in that sort of way at all.
Yeah, I think that neither of us like the idea of constriction quite so much. I mean, it's not like my mom relished that idea, but I think she really lived her life by it and let not only herself suffer, but her children suffer. And I think that what is so hopeful about this ending with Anmei and Rose is that Rose eases her constrictions a little bit. She eases her idea of duty and like lets her daughter be American. And her daughter in turn listens to her and stands up for herself and tries to get that house where in the
Sounds like a
divorce with
nice
him.
house.
Yeah, sounds like a great house. So, and it ends with this beautiful idea of this garden growing wild at Rose's house, and she imagines her mother and her like weeds growing wild, which I think is beautiful.
And what I think this constriction you allude to is yes, there's suffering that gets passed down when someone constricts themselves. And for the person who is constricting themselves by some duty, by some obligation, there's some comfort there.
Hmm.
When I think about my dad and his ability to say, no, I'm not going to go there with your mom because I have these duties, these obligations. It's almost a way of avoiding doing like self-exploration work or
Right.
self-discovery work and of limiting oneself, which is all really hard and really scary work.
Right.
And I can almost see how if the obligation is strong enough, that work can get superseded.
Yeah, that reminds me of an interview, or I think it was an interview or a quote that I read from Ocean Vuong, who is one of my favorite poets. He's Vietnamese American as well. He was born in Vietnam.
Is this the man who you said if you saw him in person, you'd fall at his feet?
Weeping.
Weeping. Okay.
Can't forget the weeping. Yes, that is him. He
Pauline and I were talking about celebrity culture and saying we aren't really into it, but there was this one poet that Pauline met. She would fall at his feet.
At this point, he's just become almost like just like this wood nymph creature. Like I just don't know if I could ever meet him because I would become extremely bizarre, and I think I would make him really uncomfortable. But anyway, so he has this great quote that he applies it more to being queer and what that means. He talks about, but I see how it also applies here because it's just another form of constraint. He talks about how um, being heteronormative, you're on like a road, a very nicely paved road with guardrails. And being queer, you're off the road. Those guardrails don't really work for you anymore because they do not fit you. You have to be heteronormative to fit in there. So you're kind of lost in the woods somewhere. No guardrails, no road, nothing. And it's terrifying, but also there's something exhilarating about that freedom. And I think you and I both kind of agree with that we really
Absolutely.
have tried to break out of our family molds, and it's been really fucking hard. But there's this amazing freedom that we have found.
Very liberating.
Yeah.
That's a great quote to kind of wrap up on May and Rose and just take us to maybe some reflections on how this book ends. We finish the book with June deciding she is going to go visit her long lost half sisters in China. She's going to go with her dad. They're on the way over there. And before they go and meet her half sisters, they first go and meet her dad's aunt, who is only 5 years older than him and who her dad hasn't seen since he was 10 years old. And it is such a beautiful, lovely embrace for those two to see each other after, I mean, 60 years pretty much.
Right.
Uh, we get this just really lovely, joy-filled story about the aunt bringing all these extended cousins, and June and her dad have these two hotel rooms at like a nice Hyatt in the city, and all 12 of them stay in those two hotel rooms and stay up all night chatting, eating, and it's just
It's lovely.
a really lovely,
Yeah.
beautiful, like unburdened, connecting across time, across space, familial love.
It's a really hopeful ending, I
It
would
is.
say, considering the book is pretty bleak throughout. There's just a lot of pain and a lot of trauma throughout the book. To have it end in such a lovely, kind of easy scene where these people are at ease with each other. They tell there's the June asks her father to tell the story of her mother finally in Chinese. So in the language in which he's the most at ease, and she can understand it. Again, this kind of approaching and meeting in the middle somehow of the generations, and it's really beautiful. And I found it so, I don't know, I yearned for it myself. I have I myself have reunited with some family members who were scattered across the globe because of the war. I met my long lost aunts in France when I lived there for a couple of years, and I met my family in Quebec when I went to go visit them. And it is this beautiful, joyous thing, to be honest. I'm so grateful that I was able to meet them because I don't know what it is. I think that when you are in an immediate family and you grow up with so much hurt and trauma because they are revealing all their hurt and trauma on you, it feels so hard to really connect with them through joy. And there's something about seeing somebody after a long time or being separated. These aunts I'd never met before. We were finally reunited, and it was like a piece of our family came back together. And I think I think it's great that the book ends that way.
I'm so glad to hear you've had those experiences. It really warms my heart. And reflecting on my own experience of this, I'm an only child, so my nuclear family is quite small, but my dad has 7 brothers and sisters. And it is not like when
Mm,
this aunt and all these cousins get together. I shake my uncle's hands rather than exchange a hug or an embrace. So it's very different. And I definitely feel a lot of longing for an easy, playful, joyful sort of reconnecting with blood, with family.
yeah.
And I think my dad does too. He has this dream of going back to Italy, where in Bari, where his family immigrated from. And I hope he sees that through someday. And maybe I'll join him.
Yeah. I think there's something kind of spectacular about going back to your homeland. I mean, it's spectacular, it's lovely, but it's also heartbreaking. I think I've told you about that when I went back to Vietnam, or back. I went to Vietnam in the first place. That was my first time ever in Vietnam. But even like the instinct to say went back to Vietnam because it feels like a homeland.
Sure.
There was something so familiar there and also so foreign. And June kind of talks about this. She tells her mother when she's young that she doesn't necessarily feel Chinese and that she doesn't really want to be Chinese. And her mother says that it cannot be helped. It is in your blood, waiting to be let go. And she ends the book by finally seeing where her Chineseness is. So this is when June is meeting her sisters and they're just weeping because they're so happy to be with each other. And she says, I look at their faces again and I see no trace of my mother in them, yet they still look familiar. And now I also see what part of me is Chinese. It is so obvious. It is my family. It is in our blood. After all these years, it can finally be let go. This is just gorgeous. I think that I feel really similarly that when I was in Vietnam and wherever I am in the world, I feel very Vietnamese. It's just in me. That's not something that I can deny, even though I'm also very American.
It's a really hopeful ending to tie together all these traumatic stories across time, across generations, across cultures into this ending where long lost half sisters from different cultures and from different places in time find each other and just embrace.
Hmm.
It is beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that it's lovely that they also see their moms in each other. And finally find their moms, which I think, honestly, aren't we all kind of looking for our moms? Yeah.
And that was the Joy Luck Club.
What a ride.
What a ride. Great book.
You can find Book Feels wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Instagram at Bookfeels Podcast or email us at bookfeelspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.